The afternoon was warm, with dry leaves swirling in the breeze scattered across the park's ground. Children laughed and shouted as they played on the swings and slides, while distracted parents chatted on nearby benches. Yet for 8-year-old Ethan, life felt silent. Since the accident, he had been confined to a wheelchair, watching the chaos unfold around him, his gaze fixed on the ground. His blue plaid jacket hung loosely on his thin frame, and his once curious, bright eyes now reflected something close to resignation. His parents, Sarah and Michael, watched from a distance with heavy hearts. Michael crossed his arms, trying to mask his distress, while Sarah made an effort to sound cheerful. "Even, look at the kids on the swing. Want to go see them?" she asked, but the question lingered unanswered. Ethan simply spun the wheel of his chair, turning away from her, his expression as cold and unmoving as stone. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by a loud, persistent bark. Everyone in the park turned toward the source of the sound. That's when Sarah saw it. A golden retriever, its fur shining like gold in the late afternoon sun, moving through the crowd with an unusual determination, as though it had a purpose. "Maggie," someone murmured from the background, but the dog paid no attention, running directly toward Ethan. As she came to a sudden stop just a few feet from him, Maggie began barking incessantly, each bark a loud and piercing sound, almost like a warning. It was as if she saw Ethan drenched in blood, staying the water from his mouth, and eyes widened. And he recoiled in his chair. Ethan's eyes widened and he recoiled in his chair. "Stay away from him," Michael shouted, raising his hands to ward off the dog, but Maggie didn't retreat. Her eyes locked onto Ethan with an intensity that seemed almost human, filled with an urgent desperation. She wasn't barking in aggression. Rather, it was as if she was pleading for attention. Ethan trembled, tears welling in his eyes. "What does she want from me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Sarah wrapped him in her arms, but a cold shiver ran down her spine. There was something in Maggie's gaze, something she couldn't quite understand. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, Ethan slowly lifted one trembling hand toward the dog. Everyone in the park held their breath, as if time itself had stopped. Maggie took a step forward, ceased her barking, and tilted her head slightly. The silence was thick, suffocating, and the tension in the air felt almost unbearable. Just as Ethan's fingertips were about to brush Maggie's head, she emitted a soft whimper, gazing at him as though trying to communicate something no one else could hear. It was as if Maggie knew something about Ethan that no one else did. Her strange behavior left everyone puzzled, and the mystery sparked by the dog's actions would soon change the course of the family's life forever. "What is she trying to tell me?" Ethan whispered, still trembling, his hand hovering just above Maggie's head. Curious about what happens next? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow this emotional journey. Ethan hesitated, pulling his hand back just before it made contact with the dog. Maggie stood motionless, her eyes never leaving his, conveying something that words couldn't explain. Sarah held her son tightly, feeling his small body quivering beneath her touch. Michael, still unsure, took a cautious step forward, attempting to push the dog away. "Go on, girl. We don't want any trouble." But Maggie remained where she was, like a statue standing guard, before letting out a low, prolonged bark, a sound more like a warning than a command. "She doesn't seem dangerous," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Michael. There was something captivating in the dog's expression, a mix of sadness and urgency. Maggie's gaze never left Ethan, as if she saw something others couldn't. Michael shook his head, unconvinced. "This is crazy. It's just a dog." Then Maggie took a step back, turned, and began walking toward the playground, pausing occasionally to look back as if she wanted someone to follow her. Ethan surprised his parents when he spoke. "She wants me to go with her," he said, his voice quiet but filled with an inexplicable certainty. Sarah and Michael exchanged a concerned glance. "That's ridiculous," Michael replied, but the unease in his voice was clear. "It's just a coincidence," Michael said, trying to maintain a sense of logic in a situation that was rapidly losing any rational explanation. But Sarah noticed something in her son for the first time in months. For the first time, he seemed interested. "Maybe we should see where she's going," she suggested, her voice hesitant, feeling deep down that this dog wasn't here by accident. Reluctantly, the three of them followed Maggie as she moved with determination. She led them to a quieter part of the park where the trees formed a natural barrier. The sounds of children's laughter and adult chatter faded into the distance, and all that could be heard now was the soft crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet. Maggie suddenly stopped in front of an old, weathered wooden bench. She dug at the ground with her paws for a moment before turning back to face Ethan. "Why's she digging there?" Michael asked, looking around as if there should be a more obvious reason. But Ethan, heart racing, felt something different. An unspoken connection. He gripped the wheel of his chair, his mind telling him to get closer. "Can you help me?" he asked his parents. Reluctantly, Michael pushed Ethan's chair closer to the spot where Maggie was pointing. As they neared, Maggie lay down beside the bench, giving a soft, low whimper. Sarah's chest tightened, while Michael shifted uncomfortably. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. But before anyone could say anything else, Ethan pointed to something half buried in the soil. A small wooden box, aged and covered in moss. Maggie barked again, her tone insistent, almost as though encouraging Ethan to open it. What could be inside? Whatever it was, it felt like a secret that needed to be uncovered. Something that seemed tied to Ethan's past. Maggie somehow seemed to know this. Ethan stared at the box, his eyes wide. The wood was cracked in places and the moss was dark and damp, as though it had been there for years. Maggie stood beside him, alternating her gaze between the box and the boy, her breathing heavy as if she were waiting for him to act. Sarah knelt beside Ethan, hesitant, while Michael nervously glanced around.
"This doesn't feel right. It's probably just trash."
He muttered, unease in his voice. "No, Dad, I want to open it," Ethan said, surprising everyone with his firm tone. It was the first time since the accident that he'd seemed so determined to do something on his own. Aaron sat silent for a few beats. Michael opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "Let him try," she whispered, sensing that this moment was important. Sarah carefully picked up the pendant, opening it to reveal an engraving inside. July 15th, 2015, JM. Ethan leaned forward, his heart racing. "This date, it's the day I was born," he murmured. Sarah and Michael exchanged a stunned glance, as if trying to understand the significance of what they had just discovered. But before they could speak, Ethan pointed at the photo. "This woman, she looks like you, Mom. Who is she?" Sarah's fingers trembled as she held the photo, shock crossing her face before she quickly masked it. I don't know, dear. Maybe it's just a coincidence," she said, her voice strangely quiet. Michael furrowed his brow, crossing his arms. "Sarah, what's going on? Do you recognize her?" he asked, his voice more forceful than he intended. Before Sarah could respond, Maggie started barking again, louder this time with an urgency that seemed almost desperate. She stepped back as if wanting to lead them somewhere else. Ethan's voice trembled with a mix of excitement and fear. "She wants us to follow her." Michael noticed something unsettling about the dog, something that couldn't be ignored. Sarah hesitated but took Ethan's hand, her eyes filled with concern and doubt, yet with a growing sense of need to uncover the truth. "Let's go," she said quietly, and the family followed Maggie once more, unaware that their next stop would bring even deeper revelations. Maggie moved with an unsettling speed, as if each step were driven by an invisible force. Her eyes were locked ahead, and she ignored everything around her. Ethan gripped the edge of his wheelchair tightly as Michael pushed him forward, cautiously avoiding branches and rocks scattered on the forest floor. Sarah followed closely behind, still clutching the medallion, her mind spinning with thoughts of the woman in the photo and the strange connection she felt. "She knows exactly where she's going," Michael murmured, not hiding his discomfort. "But how is that possible? It's like she's being guided by something bigger." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the trail ahead, but her mind was lost, drifting back to the woman in the photo. The silence of the forest was only interrupted by the sound of the wheelchair wheels and the rustling of leaves. Suddenly, Maggie stopped. She lifted her head as if listening to something that only she could hear. "Why did you stop?" Ethan asked, leaning forward in his chair. Photograph of Tomas in his hands, his grip tight as if it could anchor him to something familiar. His mind raced, unable to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions crashing over him. For the first time, he felt as though the very foundation of his identity had been ripped away, replaced by a truth he hadn't seen coming. Maggie, sensing his distress, padded quietly to the bed and curled up beside him, her warm presence a small comfort. But even the dog's gentle nudge couldn't chase away the storm inside Ethan's heart. "I need to think," he muttered, barely aware of the world around him as he turned his wheelchair and left the room. The soft hum of the wheels against the floor was the only sound in the house, each rotation a painful reminder of the things he couldn't control. Sarah watched him go, her heart breaking all over again. She sank into the couch, her hands gripping her head, as if she could somehow hold the weight of her own guilt there. Michael moved to sit beside her, but she shook her head before he could say anything. I should have told him, she whispered, the tears she had been holding back finally falling freely. I lied, Michael. Even if it was to protect him, I lied. Michael didn't know how to respond. He had always known Sarah's secret, but seeing it tear at her now was harder than he ever expected. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, but deep down, he knew this wasn't something that could be easily fixed. You had no choice, he said softly, though his words felt hollow, even to him. He looked down the hallway, his gaze following the empty space where Ethan had disappeared. The truth had been unleashed, but it was clear that their son's journey was only just beginning. There were many more questions ahead, and the road to understanding would be long and painful. In the bedroom, Ethan sat quietly, staring at the photograph of the man he'd never known, his biological father. His mind kept replaying his mother's words, each one a shock to the system. Thomas is your biological father, she had said. His eyes kept flicking to the photo, but it was as if the man in it wasn't real. How could he be real? How could he have had a life before Ethan? Before Michael? Maggie remained at his side, her head resting on his leg, offering what comfort she could, but Ethan felt miles away from everyone. The weight of the revelation felt too much to carry, and he couldn't help but wonder what else lay hidden just beneath the surface. And as if in response to his inner turmoil, Maggie rose and trotted to the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Was she trying to tell him something else? Could there be more to uncover, even beyond what had already been revealed? With a heavy sigh, Ethan wiped his eyes, took one last glance at the photograph, and pushed his wheelchair toward the door. He wasn't sure where he was going, but it felt like Maggie had a reason for what she had done today. Maybe, just maybe, she would lead him to the answers he needed, answers that could finally make sense of everything that had been left in the shadows. But one thing was certain, this journey was far from over, and with Maggie by his side, Ethan knew that the truth would eventually come to light, even if it meant uncovering things he wasn't yet ready to face. Heavy backpack with cautious hands, the leather cracking under his touch as he carefully pulled it apart. Inside there were several items, papers, a small journal, and a photograph of a young woman holding a baby in her arms. The woman's face was partially obscured by time, but there was something hauntingly familiar about her. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the image. There was no mistaking it. That's the same woman from the photo in the box, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Sarah's face went pale and she stepped forward, reaching out to gently touch the photograph. Her fingers trembled, and she looked as though she might collapse under the weight of what was unfolding. I don't understand, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she glanced between the photo and Ethan's searching eyes. I never thought I'd have to face this. Michael, kneeling beside the bag, sifted through the papers and stopped at a small letter, its edges yellowed with age. He unfolded it carefully, reading the words aloud in a soft but firm voice. Dear Sarah, if you ever find this, know that I kept my promise. I couldn't be there for you, but I never stopped loving you. I will always carry a piece of you with me. Please forgive me. Thomas. Ethan's chest tightened and a knot formed in his throat. He looked at his mother, the weight of this new revelation crashing down on him. She had loved Thomas. She had carried his memory all these years, but why had she kept all of this hidden? Sarah sank to her knees beside Michael, her hands shaking as she reached for the journal. I had to hide it, Ethan. I couldn't. She stopped, her voice breaking as she looked up at him. I couldn't bear the thought of you finding out. But now, I see, I can't protect you from the past forever. I wanted to believe that we could just move forward, but I've made things worse by keeping it from you. Ethan's voice was quiet but laced with pain. Why didn't you just tell me the truth, Mom? Why keep it all a secret? I thought it would hurt you too much, Sarah said, her voice cracking. I didn't want you to feel like you were abandoned by both of them, by him and by me. But I see now, I was wrong. The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan processed the words that had just been spoken. His mind swirled, caught between the shock of what he'd just learned and the confusion that followed. His family, his entire sense of identity, felt like it was crumbling. Maggie, still by his side, nudged his hand as if trying to comfort him, but even her presence couldn't quell the storm inside him. Michael, trying to break through the weight of the moment, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan, I know this is hard, but listen to me. You are not defined by this. Your story is still yours to write. Thomas may have been a part of it, but he doesn't get to tell you who you are. You're my son, and I've loved you from the moment I met you. Ethan's eyes flicked between his parents, his emotions too tangled to respond. He wasn't sure he was ready to accept everything they were telling him. The past had been buried for so long, and now it felt like the secrets were threatening to suffocate him. As the silence lingered, Maggie's restlessness seemed to grow once again. She stood up, walked toward the door, and began barking again, this time with even more urgency. "And what now?" Michael muttered, clearly frustrated but also unsettled by the dog's behavior. Ethan, feeling the weight of all the unanswered questions hanging in the air, stood up slowly, using his chair to support him. "I think I need to follow her," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Michael and Sarah exchanged a glance, both worried but understanding. Maggie had led them to this point, and Ethan felt a need to continue the search for answers, no matter how painful they might be. Ethan turned and wheeled toward the door, his heart pounding as he followed Maggie once more. He didn't know what would come next, but he was determined to face it. Whatever lay ahead, he couldn't keep living in the shadows of the past. Maggie led them outside once again, her steps sure and unwavering as she moved toward the distant tree line. The family followed her, unsure of what they would find next, but knowing that with every step they were drawing closer to the truth. And as the cold night air wrapped around them, Ethan's mind finally began to quiet, if only for a moment. He was ready to confront whatever had been hidden for so long. But even as the darkness surrounded them, the question still lingered. What had Maggie uncovered that they had yet to understand? The walk back to the house was silent, each family member deep in thought, their minds racing with the weight of the day's discoveries. Ethan's hand clutched the cassette tape, the words, "For Ethan," written in his biological father's handwriting, a heavy reminder of the journey that had led him to this point. Maggie, with her steady pace, led the way, her tail occasionally swishing with a sense of purpose that no one could quite explain, but all of them had come to trust. When they returned to the house, Sarah led them to the basement, the creaky stairs echoing in the stillness. It was an old, musty space, filled with forgotten items and dusty shelves. Sarah went to a corner, moving aside some boxes before uncovering an old cassette player. She wiped the dust from the surface and plugged it in, her movements slow, as if this moment carried an unspoken significance. Ethan sat down, his hand still trembling as he set the tape inside. The family gathered around, each of them waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Maggie sat by Ethan's side, her presence a quiet comfort, but even she seemed aware that this moment was different from all the others. As the cassette clicked to life, an old, crackling voice filled the room, one that was unmistakably Thomas's. "Ethan." Tana's voice began, filled with a mixture of warmth and sorrow. "If you're hearing this, then the time has come for you to understand everything I couldn't tell you before. First, I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Even though I wasn't there, you've always been in my heart." Ethan closed his eyes, the words filling him with a bittersweet ache. He had spent his life without this man, without understanding why his father had disappeared. But now, Thomas's voice, his presence, was filling the room, and it was almost as though he had always been there, waiting for this moment. "I left," Thomas continued, "because I wasn't ready to be the father you needed. I was reckless, selfish even. But when I found out about you, it was too late. I couldn't come back. But I made a choice, Ethan. A choice to ensure that you would always know the truth, even if I couldn't be there. That's why I found Maggie. She's not just a dog. She's a bridge to your past, to the family you deserve. I knew you would need her one day." The room fell silent again, the weight of Thomas's words settling over them all. Michael glanced at Sarah, his face filled with confusion and concern, but he said nothing, letting the words speak for themselves. "Maggie has always been meant to guide you," Thomas's voice continued. "And now she's brought you here, to this moment. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan. I don't even know if you can, but I want you to know one thing. You're not alone. You have a family, and you have love, even when it doesn't come from where you thought it would." Ethan could feel his heart beating faster as he absorbed the final words. "Maggie will always be there for you," Thomas said, his voice softening with the tenderness that Ethan had never imagined could come from someone who had been absent from his life. "She will guide you, just like she's done today. Whatever comes next, you are ready. And remember, love isn't defined by blood. It's defined by the choices we make." The tape clicked off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Ethan sat still, his mind processing everything he had just heard. The confusion, the anger, the betrayal, everything was still there, but now there was something else too: understanding. It didn't erase the years of uncertainty, but it helped make sense of it all. Maggie, as if sensing the shift in the air, nudged Ethan gently. He looked down at her, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled, weakly but genuinely. "You were always there for me, weren't you?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Maggie's tail wagged slowly, and she pressed her head against his leg in a comforting gesture, as though to say that yes, she had always known what was coming. Sarah and Michael stood behind him, each of them giving him space to process the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah's voice was soft as she spoke. "I didn't want you to have to carry all of this, Ethan. But I see now that it was never about me protecting you from the past. It was about you facing it in your own time. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Maggie. I think I'm starting to understand, Mom, he said quietly. It's not about the past anymore, it's about what comes next. And with Maggie, I think I'm ready to face it. As the family stood there, the weight of the years, old secrets finally seemed to lift, replaced by something stronger, a sense of resolution, even if they still didn't have all the answers. Maggie, as always, had been the guide, the constant presence that had led them through the darkness. With the full moon shining through the window, Ethan felt for the first time that the path ahead, though uncertain, was his to walk, and he wouldn't be walking it alone. The mystery of his biological father had been revealed, but there was still much to discover about his future. What mattered most now, though, was the love he had with his family, and the unwavering loyalty of the dog who had never given up on him. As the story unfolded, it became clear some mysteries were meant to be solved, and some bonds were meant to last forever.